Welcome. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kitshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah.
Amen.
So here we are, where this chapter 15 is sort of it's a memorable chapter. That's a chapter number one tries to remember. Just like chapter 12 of Genesis is the beginning of Lech, beginning of Abraham's journey. Chapter 15 is this covenant between the pieces that clearly has implications even for today. So, Vayhi Hashemesh ba'a, the sun was setting. Ve'alata haya, there was great darkness. V'hine tanur ashan, and behold, a furnace of fire. Ve'lapid esh, and a torch. Again, ashan is actually smoke. Lapid esh, and a torch of fire, a fiery torch, asher avar bein hagzarim ha'ela, which passed between these pieces. Remember, he had taken these animals and cut them in pieces, divided them up, and now there was this pathway in between. I'm sure that there's a lot more specific symbolism involved in this, but at least on the surface, it would appear to say that making such a covenant tries to do it in this way, emphasizes that it's sort of a life or death issue. It is very, very, very serious. So I imagine that's what this is saying, but there probably is some very interesting specifics regarding the symbolism, which unfortunately at this point I do not know. So going on. Bayom Hahu, on that day, Karat Hashem it Aram Brit Lemor. The Lord cut, literally karat means to cut off, to cut. And that, of course, comes from cutting the animals, right? It Abraham, with Abraham, a covenant saying, here we go, lezar'acha, to your seed, natati et haaretz hazot. I have given to your seed, I have given this land, minahar Mitzrayim, from the river of Egypt. We have to assume that's the Nile, right? Ad hanahar hagadol, until the great river Nahar Prat, the Euphrates. So all that area, presumably, God promised to Abram and his descendants. So taking a look, let's see if we have it here. Right. Lezar'acha Natati, to your seed I have given. Amar Rabbi Huna b'shem Rabbi Shmuel bar Nachman, said Rabbi Huna in the name of Rabbi Shmuel, the son of Nachman. Lezar'acha, to your seed, eten ein ketivat kam. It doesn't say, I will give it to your seed. Ella, but lezar'acha natati, but to your seed I have given. Kfar natati, I've already given it. And this is from the Talmud Yerushalmi, Tractate Chala, Chapter 2, Halacha 1. So this is where he has done the Torah T'mimah has done his research in terms of this particular passage. So let's look into this deeper. And what he's trying to say is, Sheme'ata tihye Eretz Yisrael muchzeket l'Israel. That from this moment, in other words, when the moment that he was speaking to Abraham, right, the land of Israel would be attributed to the Jewish people. Beyusha, as an inheritance. Me'avotehem, from their forefathers, from their ancestors. Af kodem sheyikansu l'sham, even before they entered there. In other words, from this moment on, the title of the land of Israel would go to the Jewish people, even though they hadn't actually possessed it physically. But the title, the legal title, so to speak, now belonged to them. For Alpida Shazo, and according to this interpretation, Kinire, it would appear, Kaimalan Ba'alma, right? We have, in general, right, we have this idea, and this is in Baba Batra, page 117b, the Eretz Yisrael, that the land of Israel, Morashahu Yisrael Ma'avotehem. So we have this din, as it were, that the land of Israel is an inheritance to the Jewish people from their ancestors. Vezohi kavanat lashon haTorah, and this is the intention of the expression in the Torah, of the language of the Torah, beparsha va'era, in the parsha of Va'era, and that's later on in Exodus. Natati otam lachem morasha, where God says to Moses to tell the Jewish people, essentially, that God has given this land he's taken them to as a morasha, as an inheritance. V'nafka mina bazeh, and there's a practical application of this. In other words, we get from out of this the inyan shehayu b'habachorim, that the fact that the firstborn males, shel yotzei Mitzrayim, of those who went out of Egypt, notlim shnei chalakim, that they inherit a double portion, bechelkei avotehem, in the portion of their ancestors, be'eretz Israel, in the land of Israel. So that when they actually would divide it up, the firstborn would then get a double portion compared to all the other siblings. Afal pi, despite the fact that in general, ein habachor notel, bera'ui kevemuchzak. In other words, we have a law that if you're talking about property that is going to come into the hands of the father, it hasn't come in yet, but it hasn't actually transferred yet, but it is something that the state can claim, right? That the firstborn does not get a double portion of that. He only gets a double portion of that which they're actually in possession of. So this is important now in regards to this point that we're just made here, this midrash that we have, because it is now more than just a claim on the land of Israel. It's as if it is in fact their inheritance. V'gam kan, okay, right? So here too, be'eta chalukah, in the time when they were distributing the land after the tribes had entered and conquered the land. But at this particular point, right, when God is speaking to Abraham, Adain lo nichnasula. You couldn't say that the Jewish people had actually entered into the land. It wasn't in their actual possession. Ach mikevan sh'haita haaretz muchzeket, right? But because it is muchzak, which means it is their portion. It is considered actually their portion now. They have a chazaka on it. So in other words, a hold, literally. Lahachzik is to hold on to. Natlu ba pishnaim kedin habachor. Therefore, they would have this law of the double portion to the bachor, to the firstborn. So that's the significance of this particular passage that we just read. Let's go on here. Okay. Into the next page. And okay, let me make sure I have the place. Yes, the last part of it said Et nahar hagadol nahar prat, right? The large river, the great river, the river Euphrates. Mikan haya Shimon ben Tarfon Omer. From this passage, in other words, it's saying that it's to the great river, the river Euphrates. Shimon ben Tarfon used to say, Krav legabe dahina, draw near to one who is anointed, ve'idhin or idhan, and become anointed. That if you draw close to one who is anointed, you too will become anointed. In other words, your association, if you associate with great people, you yourself will gain greatness. That's essentially what he's saying here. That if you get next to someone who has got oil on them, you'll get oil on you too. The Bay Rabbi Ishmael Tana, right, in the school of Rabbi Ishmael, they used to teach Eved Melech Kamelech, that the servant of a king is like a king. And this is from Tractate Shavuot, page 47b. Let's take a look at this. So he's translating, right, the Krav Lagabe Dehina Ve'idhin. He's translating that. Im nagata b'mashuach. b'shemen, if you touch a person who is anointed with oil, tiyeh gam ata mashuach, you yourself will become anointed, b'negiato, in touching him. And he explains dahina hulashon shemen, that the word dahina in Aramaic means it has the meaning of oil or anointing, right? Or being anointed with oil. Ve'al hapasuk hudashna mechalav. There's a verse in Isaiah chapter 40, sorry, 34, right? There's this expression here, which means, so it's either chalev or chalav, something like that, but here is filled with fat, is Hudashna is sort of like you sort of pouring over with fat. Okay. Mitarganinan, there the Aramaic translation says it 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 dehina is anointed. Takes that expression. The Tam Hamashal, and the reason for this proverb, Lakan, here, regarding this place here, Ritzono Lomar, and that why is he getting it out of this particular verse? It has to do with this. Prat hu nahar hakatan me arba naharot, that in fact, the Euphrates, when they're discussing in Genesis the four rivers, right? The Euphrates was the smallest, right? It's the smallest of the four rivers, Haminuyim Parshat Bereshit, that are counted, right? That are mentioned in the parsha of Genesis. Kamoshe Katuv Sham, because it states there, Vahanahar Harivi'i Hu Prat. It says, and the fourth river was the Euphrates. Vakan, but here, who Kore Ota Hanahar Agadol, but here he calls it the Great River. Mishum deniskeret al Shem Eretz Yisrael. Why? Because of its connection, right? It's being mentioned in connection with the land of Israel. Shehi chashuva, because that's considered significant. The land of Israel is considered important, significant. Niskeret gamhi b'shevach. So the river itself is also mentioned in a praiseworthy kind of way. So now we understand better this proverb and what it's trying to say. Now, we went on to say, Eved melech kamelech, right? That the servant of a king or the slave of a king is like a king. Okay, so mashal kaful berayonot shonim. So this is a parallel proverb. It's saying basically the same thing, the same thing. The association, when you associate with greatness, you become great yourself, right? So it's just put in a different kind of idea with different ideas. Uktsat kasher. And this place is actually there's a small challenge, a small difficulty, al Baal Torah Or, on the author of the Torah Or. So I looked up the Torah Or, right? And this is what I found. So interestingly enough, right, to a foundational collection of Hasidic mystical teachings, Ma'amarim, by Rabbi Shneir Zalman of Liadi, of course, who was the first Chabad Rebbe, focusing on the five books of Moses, published in two volumes. Torah Or was the first volume, and Likutei Torah was the second volume, that delve into divine service and Chabad philosophy, contrasting with the broader Torah, meaning the five books of Moses or all Jewish law. So he's referring to Rabbi Shneir Zalman, the founder of Chabad, right? So, Shetziyen pasuk, what was the mistake, quote quote, is that he mentions this particular passage, the Parshat Varim, right? That he associates this whole idea here with the passage in Dvarim, in Deuteronomy, velo pasuk ze hamukdam, and not this earlier verse. In other words, this idea, right, that if you are associating with with greatness, you become great. He takes this interpretation based on a much later verse instead of the very first time it occurs. And the very first time it occurs, it still has this particular concept. Right? That's the difficulty. Ve'imishum, so he's trying to explain, ve'imishum diskar sham hanahar al shem Eretz Yisrael, but the reason for his doing this is because of the direct connection it has in that particular context in Deuteronomy to the land of Israel. Halo gam hacha nizkeret Hashem Eretz Yisrael kamo shekatavnu. But we see here too, it has to do with the fact that it is referencing the land of Israel, that the Euphrates River is being stated as a border of the land of Israel. So that does not work. So he leaves it at that. He says, it's just an interesting, you might call it slip up if you want to, at any rate. I'm not sure if there's any other agenda involved in this, but it's interesting. I'll leave it at that. Going uh, on to verse 19. Let's see what we've got here. Etakeni, right? So he mentions these particular tribes, the Kenite, Etakenizi, the Kenizzite, the Etakadmoni, and the Cadmonite, the Etachiti, and the Hittite, the Etaprizi, and the Perizzite, the Etarephaim, and the Rephaim. I'm going to finish this up. Ve'eta Emori, the Amorite, ve'eta Knaani, and the Canaanite, ve'eta Girgashi, and the Girgashite, ve'eta Yevusi, and the Jebusite. Now, if you want to, let's count up the number of nations that are mentioned here. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. There are 10 nations here, 10 Canaanite nations, or 10 nations that were occupying that particular area. But in general, we talk about the land of the 7 nations. Yes, Lauren?
Why is Rephaim in plural?
I'm not sure if there was another previous comment which mentioned that possibly that there were different tribes that got together in that particular that made up the Rephaim. It could be. That might be one reason. My recollection too is that the Rephaim were also like giants, but it would make sense. I mean, that's a great question, and if in fact it was the fact that different tribes got together and united, that's why it's in the plural. Okay? So I'm going to go on with this particular. We'll see what we can do here. So here we go. So we have 10 nations mentioned here. In general, there are only 7. And the first 3 are not mentioned generally when they're specified. And that, of course, would leave us the 7. Eta Kini Gomer. So the Kenite, etc. Tanya. So there's an early source that says, My dichtiv. How is it written in Parshat Nitzavim? This is later on, quite a bit later on in Deuteronomy, towards the end of Deuteronomy. Ve'hetivcha, he will do good to you. But remember, tov often means completion, right? Vehir becha me'avotecha, and make you greater than your ancestors. Rabbi Elazar. So what is this? What is it? What is he referring to? In other words, what are we really talking about? If we're talking about he will do good to you, and make you greater than your ancestors. In what way, right? Rabbi Elazar patarla la'atid lavor. So Rabbi Elazar explained that this has to do in the future time. So we could be talking here about the Messianic era. Not nowadays, but later on. Avotecha yashu eretz shiva amamim. Your ancestors inherited the land of the 7 nations. Va'atem, but in the future, this is in the Messianic time, atidim lirash eretz shel eser amamim. You're going to inherit the land of 10 nations, 3 more. Hani tlata acharini man inun. And what about this? So these additional 3, what are we referring to? Etakini, ve'etaknizi, ve'etakadmoni, right? The Kenite, the Kenizzites, and the Cadmonites. And that's in the Talmud Yerushalmi, Masechet Kiddushim, Tractate Kiddushim, chapter 1, halacha 8. So those nations are, he tells us, Vahem Edom, they're actually referring to the areas of Edom, Ammon, and Moab, right? Those are the nations that are actually right next to the land of Israel. V'tam hadavar, and the reason for this, Iran Hakadosh Baruch Hu la'atid. Why were they in fact left for future time? Yesh lomar, one could say, kedei laharot chiba yetera levanav acharav, in order to show a greater measure of love for his children after him. We're talking now about the fact that God is speaking to Abraham, or Abram at this point, and that the reason for this has to do that he wanted to let Abram know just the degree to which he loved Abram's descendants. The Nach Kamina Bazel Ladina, and this also has now a legal application. Ki be'et hamelech hamashiach, that at the time of King Messiah, sheyitusfu artzot ele, right, that these lands that we just mentioned will be added, yudrushim lehosif bahem harei miklat. The practical application is that when they get these three additional lands, they would have to, because this is the context of the Deuteronomy passage, that they would have to add cities of refuge into these areas as well. This is interesting. For me, it raises a little bit of a question because I really thought that in Messianic time, people's behavior would in fact appreciably improve. But remember, the cities of refuge were a case of manslaughter. In other words, an unintentional killing. So the people could still be good, but we're talking about here essentially relatively accidental death. There is a deep discussion as to the nature of the accident and to what degree a person is responsible ahead of time. So, for example, if the accident comes about because of wood chopping and the axe head falls off, what direction are you pointing when you are moving the axe? Are you moving it upwards or downwards? And I suspect also to what degree did you ensure that the axe head wouldn't come off? That those are all issues that have to do with whether or not it's an actual case of manslaughter, but at least in fact of it happening in the Messianic era, the need for cities of refuge in the Messianic era, I think we can answer it in the fact that we're talking strictly about as an accidental, where death has come accidentally. Right. So, Kemosh Katuv beParshat Shoftim, as is written in the Parsha of Shoftim, that's also, of course, in Deuteronomy. It goes on to see, V'chi yarchiv Hashem et gvulcha. It says, when the Lord widens your borders, v'yasafta lacha od shalosh arim, and it says, you will then add another three cities. Going on, new idea. Ve'ien b'midrash Rabbah, and if you look at Midrash Rabbah, Parshazo, this particular Parsha, Sof Perek Mem Daled, excuse me, one second. And this, I think he's referring to Genesis and this particular pasuk that Genesis Rabbah is discussing at the end of chapter 44. Ita bezehalashon. We have this language here. He's quoting now. Kach Allah beda'ato shel makom. So it came to mind to the Holy One, lahanchil lahem liYisrael, to give as an inheritance to the Jewish people, Eretz Asara Amamim, that the land of 10 nations, Velo natan lahem ela shiva, but he only gave them seven. In other words, his original thought was to give them 10, but he actually only gave them seven. Velama shiva, pirushan lael, and then it goes on to say, and why seven? Pirushan lael. The explanation of it is above. Adkan, and that's the quotation. For Amlu Me'od HaMafarshim. And one second. And the people interpreting Midrash Rabbah, they struggled greatly in trying to explain this. Ve'inyan hamilot perushan la'el. In other words, what exactly is it referring to say that the explanation was above? In other words, somewhere above in the previous discussions in Midrash Rabbah, one would think that's what this is referring to. It explains why 7 now and 10 later, that's explained above. Rerovan machakutan. And so many of these people who were looking at trying to interpret it, they eliminated those words. They eliminated the words Perushan La'el. They said it's a mistake. It shouldn't be in the text. It's a bad recension. Aval, but in fact, he says, Lada'ati, in my humble opinion, kamo barur hadavar, okay, that the matter becomes quite clear, ki ach ta'utso in kal yishkan, that if you're talking about a scribal error, it's a very slight scribal error. In other words, he's going to say, you didn't need to cut out those words, but there's a slight scribal error. V'habi'ur al pi divrei Rabbi Elazar kan. And to understand what it means by, as explained above, right, those words anyway, can be explained according to the words of Rabbi Eliezer here by Yerushalmi, in the Yerushalmi, right, Asher ki yadua, because we know that Rov Agadot Yerushalmiot, that most of the Agadata in the Talmud Yerushalmi, Mekuvanot im Agadot Midrash Rabbah, they're parallel to Agadot mentioned in the Midrash Rabbah. And when I was preparing my course on Midrash Rabbah, I actually came across a theory that Midrash Rabbah is the Agadata of the Talmud Yerushalmi. There's very little Agadata, that is to say, sort of legendary interpretation, midrashic interpretation in the Yerushalmi. It mostly deals strictly with halacha, with law. But the fact that the Agadata to be found in is actually in Midrash Rabbah. And just to add one more point is that that's because that in the Talmud Bavli, in the Babylonian Talmud, there's plenty in many of the Masechtot. There's a lot of what we would call Agadata, right? So. Patar la la'atid lavo. In other words, when Rabbi Elazar said, he explained that la'atid lavo, okay, that we need to explain this atid lavo, v'tzarich lomar b'midrash rabbah. In other words, he was saying that in the future, God would give them the other three nations as well. V'tzarich lomar b'midrash rabbah, perushan la'atid lavo. We need to read it not as La'el, right? So look at this. We're looking at these two little stroke marks that indicate, I'm going to make this larger, these stroke marks to indicate an abbreviation. And what happened, right? So what happened was possibly in printing or in copying, one of these stroke marks got eliminated, and the other one was interpreted as a yud, as a yud. That's what he's saying. So Rashi Tevot, and I'll La'atid lavo. It's not that you want to read that Midrash Rabbah as la'el, as above, quote, quote, but as an abbreviation for la'atid lavo. V'hu al pi hadrasha shelefanenu. And it fits perfectly with this interpretation that we just had. Sha'ashlosha notarim, that the three remaining nations, Pirushan la'atid lavo, the explanation is that in the future, litanan azli Israel, that at that point he would give them to the Jewish people, shkamo shekatavnu, just as we wrote originally, the dok QED. And we will stop the lesson right here. And if you have any other comments to make, interesting, just the originality and the you know the thoughtfulness of Torah T'mimah. So
So I'm just sort of reacting
yes,
at your comment of the agadic nature of
yes,
the Midrash, perhaps reflecting the Jerusalem Talmud.
yes,
What I've just started, and Margie as well, we've just started in our group in Akron
right.
studying Bereshit Rabbah.
Right.
and I've never looked at it before. We have the Kleinman text. And the structure strikes me as being a parallel to Talmud, where it's basically referenced, footnoted, justified. It's not just a bunch of stories out of, pulled out of midair. There are basically references to Talmud and to other works that would make one think this is a parallel or this is an addition to the Talmud itself.
So it's actually a different approach, though, to Judaism.
I would
Right. It's
agree.
not it's
Yes.
not in it's
Yes.
not in conflict at all.
Right.
Talmud basically deals primarily with halacha.
Correct.
In, you know, incidentally, it also brings in what I remember reading in Steinsaltz he calls theology. In other words, the Agadata, which we would translate as legendary material, it really isn't a good translation because it's very difficult to find a good translation for the term Agadata. Very often it does involve stories, but not always. Sometimes it's simply a deeper metaphorical analysis of the biblical text, right? So it deals a lot with metaphor and also a deeper understanding of the text as a text, which doesn't always involve stories.
Right.
But there's also my sense about this is that what we had written down in the Torah itself, in the written Torah, is a fraction of the traditions that actually existed amongst the people before it was actually written down or it was put down in this particular form. And so that many of these midrashim, some of them, when they're given in the name of a rabbi, have to do with original thinking regarding the text and the interpretation of the text. And some of them, which are anonymous, may well go back to, parallel ideas that follow the text itself,
Mhm.
that might be as old as the text itself. But it's a different form. It's an oral form
Right.
of the Torah. It's another element of oral Torah. So that's at least where I'm at, subject to critique and disproof. But that's sort of my understanding of things. Uh,
It makes sense.
yeah, well, it did to me.
Yes. Okay. Very good.
So anyway, yeah, it's and a lot of the stuff that we're doing here in Torah T'mimah, it's taken from Midrash Rabbah, it's taken from the Talmuds, it's taken from all over. Essentially, the best we could do is sort of say interpretation. In other words, if we were to translate Agadata as interpretation, but it's really inadequate. In some ways, Agadata is parallel to the Hebrew word Haggadah. So I would say, oral interpretations. Maybe so, but it encompasses more than just law. In fact, it
Mhm.
tends to be more in the lines of belief and understanding and values in general, a lot of the stuff that we're doing here. So we'll stop with this.